Thanks again, Ed, for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk with me. So I wondered if we could just kind of go through a little bit of your personal history and get some of your personal stories from mainly from the 1970s and then the 80s as well. How were you first politicized?
Yeah, I, it got me thinking, what does being politicized mean? Let's put it this way. I was ordained a priest in 1968. By then, I was politicized in the sense that I was already getting involved in social issues, but not yet politicized in the sense of addressing government or things like that. Because I mean, I was a fairly traditional seminarian, kind of studying philosophy, studying theology. People who later saw me as an activist were wondering why it happened because I was in more or less a bookworm in the seminary. I read a lot. My philosophy was very abstruse, like pre-Vatican II on Thomas Aquinas and all that. But what happened was after my masteral degree in philosophy, I was sent for a year to teach in the northern province of Abra, which is run by the SVD, but it is for the diocese. And I taught junior high school. And later, some of those seminarians became guerrilla priests. So some military intelligence presumed wrongly that I must have politicized them that early. But no truth to that at all. I was teaching them English literature, you know. But 1964 was when I was there, and 64 was the eve of what was then supposedly the 400th anniversary of Christianization in the Philippines in 1565 when Legazpi and Urdaneta came. Right now, the church wants to celebrate 500th anniversary in 1521 in Magellan. I'm not sure if that is valid because it was a one-off thing. He came, he got killed. Anyway, because it was the year before the 400th anniversary of Christianization, I read and I was part of those who were saying, after 400 years, what have we to show for it? There were two issues. One is our Christianity sufficiently Filipino or is it very Western? The other, which was the beginning of politics, you might call it, is we're a Catholic country, the only one. Are we a better country because we're Catholic? How come our politicians are corrupt? How come there's a lot of poverty? How come there's a lot of injustice? Maybe I'm projecting back. I don't know what was going on in my head then. Except that time, a Jesuit priest who was a social psychologist, Father Jaime Bulatao, wrote what I consider a pretty significant longish essay on what he called split level Christianity in the Philippines, where he says, you know, not just among the poor but also among the elite, there is this received ideas, concepts about what is moral, what is good, but in actual practice we follow another set of principles. They might call them traditional values. They might call... Anyway, when that happened, I said, oh, because some of his advocacies was we need more native clergy. We need to make Christianity more Filipino. So because I was more intellectually bent, I said, well, we should write a Filipino theology. And that triggered a decision because by the end of that year, I received a letter from my superior saying, oh, Ed, since you're good in class, we'll send you to Rome to study theology. Please fill up these forms. The forms are so thick, I was too lazy to fill them up. That was the real reason, but then I had to justify it. So I said, oh, well, thank you, but I like to write Filipino theology. I cannot write that if I go to Rome. That's it. I still wonder right now, what if I accepted that and I went to Rome? Anyway, that's easier said than done. So I returned to Tagaytay then. How do you write Filipino theology? And there were two paths. One was, I said, maybe Filipino because we seem so alienated, middle class, intellectuals. Maybe it's among indigenous people. And I come from Mindoro. The indigenous people there are the Mangyans. And I don't know exactly the year, but it was a summer and I volunteered to teach not catechism but literacy to the Mangyans. The Latin script, they had their indigenous script. And I remember then there was a Dutch missionary, fellow SB, the anthropologist, Father Postma, he has died now, who said, oh, Ed, nice idea, Filipino Christianity. Are you sure it's not only Tagalog Christianity? What about Mangyan Christianity? Ooh, I said, where would that have gone? I don't know. But coming back to study theology, at some summer, superiors decided to organize special summer classes because Secretary of Education pushed back the opening of classes to September from June. So we had 2 months. And in traditional management of the church, idleness is the workshop of the devil. So they had to keep us busy. So they started organizing different classes. And one of the classes was was a seminar on Catholic social teachings as applied to social justice and agrarian reform. And the speaker was Attorney Jeremias Montemayor, who was the president of the Federation of Free Farmers. That was crucial, but not for me. I enrolled on the class on German language. It was my fellow seminary who said, "Oh, Ed, this is great. Finally, we have a mission." But I said, "Come on, that's social issues in the Philippines. We are supposed to be missionaries. We should go abroad." So in that sense, they were politicized ahead of me. But then they were very clever. It was the 60s, folk songs, Peter, Paul, and Mary, Bob Dylan. And I was a folk singer. And they said, "Ed, one of our projects is we will raise funds for a farmers training center. And you are a good singer with your group. We will move around the colleges and raise funds." Of course, that was very attractive to a seminarian who was a folk singer. We'll be singing to a lot of college girl students. So we went around. Then we built the training center. And then what happened was the Federation of Free Farmers hooked up with the Society of the Divine Word and said, "Would you help us in our leadership formation program for the farmers?" It was a 5-week, and I spoke at some, but it was minor. What was more crucial is at the end of the 5 weeks, they spent 3 days in Tagaytay at the Farmers Training Center. And we were handling a retreat for them where we had to talk to them about the meaning of their work. And I remember the topic given to me was the meaning of work, the theology of work. And I remember going to the library and I couldn't find any book except one that's very vague. Because the question the farmer said was very simple. Do you think work is God's will or a punishment for sins? If it's God's will, it's so hard. If it's punishment for sins, you mean we are more sinful than the landowners? So that whole question of, so slowly, the whole issue of, what does it mean to be Christian, to be religious, and all that? So I date my politicization then, because from personal individual issues, which they would always ask, personal morality, do I drink too much, do I go to mass, do I gamble, do I sleep with someone else, not my, the usual personal morality issue, the questions were different. Hey, I worked so hard to till this land, but I have to give half to my landlord, and there is a land reform law, but he doesn't want to give it, so I file a case in court. When we fight, I get very mad at him. They tell me, "You're not a good Christian. Why don't you love your landowners?" So it was, in a sense, theology. Later, in the activist tradition, I codified this story more like this. Like in the height of Christian activism before martial law, some young Christian, more Protestant than Catholic activists, I think, spray painted underneath sign at some chapel that had the sign, "Christ is the answer." And they spray painted, "What's the question?" And for me, I kind of elaborated, well, if your question is, why am I sinful? How shall I be saved? Surrender to Christ. And you have theology of personal salvation, which is a valid theology. But if the question is, why am I poor? How will I get justice? And you still say Christ is the answer, then they say, "Now explain." And I tell people, you could go to jail. Which really, fast forward, and this really happened in, I think it was in Camp Olivas, in my first imprisonment. At night, we had time, so we sat around and said, similar to your question, but sharper, what path led you to prison? So not just politicalization, but oppositionist politics, radical politics, dangerous politics. Why are you in jail? And the others had very dramatic stories. Well, I'm a guerrilla, I got caught. One says, I'm a trade unionist and strikes were banned. Another was a community organizer in the urban poor. Another was a student activist who was caught after speaking at a rally. Then they asked me, "And you?" I said, "I was just trying to write theology." And they all laughed. No one gets imprisoned for writing theology. I said, it depends on the theology. So it's a long and winding road that I wasn't like an instant politicized person. I read the Catholic social teaching, but in the seminary, you read stuff that you don't really always practice or what. What made it real for us is because it got interpreted not only by Jeremias Montemayor, who is really an eloquent speaker, but the reality that, Catholic social teaching for social justice includes believing in the power of the poor to achieve justice, helping them organize, challenge the government, not in a radical Marxist way, but just for reforms. And with that, then he says, and that is Christian. That's Matthew 25. I was hungry and you gave me food to eat. And that is a social problem. That's not individual charity. So we said, this is something. The politics was not secular. It was in the SVD theology of incarnation, the word become flesh. This is the incarnation of what it means to be a Christian. And in particular, what the Pope talks about Catholic social teaching. And I really think that for me was, then obviously afterwards you read all stuff, secular stuff, radical stuff, all kinds of stuff. But for me, that was the the initial core because I felt then it was a very appropriate bridge from a relatively, if not conservative, at least fairly traditional understanding of faith and Christianity. And then it says, oh, you can be for reforms, and it's Christian, so it's not scary. Secondly, it's not communist, therefore, and in fact, it might be the reason why we can prevent revolution. Because if there is revolution, it will be led by communists. While if it is reform, oh, well, then it can be safely Christian. Except, of course, the landowners and conservative Christians call that communist. So I said, now, what does that mean? So that's the broadest. Now, how it becomes this rather than that is now a function of which groups I encountered and with whom I had dialogue. But that was the origin before any encounter with explicitly activist political movements and political literature. The closest I would have would be the literature of the Federation of Free Farmers, the Catholic social teaching, some of his books. So that's it.
Interesting. So do you, I guess, fast forward from 64, is it? Or is...
Yeah, 64 to, I'd say, well, when I was ordained a priest, 68, they asked me actually to preach in the name of my classmates. And I already talked then about we are committed to interpret our priesthood as service to people, but not in the usual pastoral ministry, but to work like with the FFF, to organize them, to make them develop their potential so that instead of justice being given to them by others, including us, they will be part of those who will achieve justice, not by themselves, but by being part of the struggle for reform. So our class had a reputation, partly deserved, that we were maybe the first activist class, ordination class in the SBD, and that was 68. After that, they asked me, and they do that in the SBD, what kind of assignment do you want? And I told them, well, they wanted me to teach in the seminary. I said, I like to be a chaplain of the Federation of Free Farmers. So we had a compromise. I was allowed to be a chaplain, but I also had to teach in the seminary.
Fast forward to martial law being declared in 1972. I was doing a bit of background research, and you gave a rally on the day that, you gave a sort of a rally speech on the day that martial law was declared. How did you go from being a chaplain to speaking at rallies?
Well, as a chaplain, and this is 69, so forget 72, we were all getting frustrated because there was an accumulation of legal cases by the Federation of Free Farmers, and hardly any was resolved, and some of the farmer leaders were getting harassed. In the meantime, we were recruiting students, particularly from the University of the Philippines in Los Baños, to work with the Federation of Free Farmers. It was like a Catholic renewal movement called the Kiro movement. Kiro is the Greek acronym for Christ. And in addition to telling them about Catholic social teaching, they would go on weekends to the rural areas where there were Federation of Free Farmer members. They would document their cases, and then they would work with them to go to the government offices to follow up. And at some point, they were saying, Ed, this thing's not enough. And they're students. We better mount an honest goodness. And they didn't just want a rally. They wanted to rally and have a permanent picket at the Department of Justice and stay there so that the government will negotiate with us until all the cases were resolved. And of course, we were ignored. And so one day they said, Ed, we have to force the issue. So interesting, and I don't know how that happened. A group of them said, come with us. We barged into the presidential palace. I don't know why they didn't shoot us. I guess they said, anyway, these are not communists. They're just angry. So we were there with a dialogue, and to their credit, they said, okay, we'll set up a permanent dialogue committee, Presidential Action Committee for Social Justice and Reforms, and you. So daily, there were negotiations, and if there was a case somewhere there, the government would give transportation to fly a fact-finding team to go there. So it must have been over 50, 60 days. We were there. I dropped out of teaching. We were just there, and we were moving around talking to different schools so that, because we used to say, farmers have the cause but no voice. And the youth, and it was partly a critique of, in fact, the radical youth, yeah, plenty of voices, but their causes are very abstract. It's nothing. So at some point, we ran out of funds and energy. So we said, okay, let's go home. Elections are coming. People are not going to pay attention to land issues. And then they said, okay, Ed, but before we go, let's not slink like beaten people into the night. Let's have one last rally. Hurrah! So what happened is, ironically, 69, it was a political rally at Plaza Miranda for Marcos, and they had plenty of torches at night. So these young people, they got 200 torches. There were only 200 of us. Went back to our place. We moved round and round singing, kind of feigning bravado, although we knew we lost. And I remember at the end of that, and this is important because it presages in a way EDSA. They said, okay, before we go, priest, speak. So I said, oh my God, what do I say? You can't give easy words at a time like that. You have to capture that you're feeling down, but at the same time, you have to rouse their spirits. And I don't know exactly what I said. People later said, oh, that was good. What I remember was I told them, look, there were no lights in the Luneta then. That was so I was here, dark night, 200 torches. My heart really sank. So I told them, why are we holding our torches in the dark? You think we can dispel the darkness? No way! We need millions! So, why? Well, I said, so that you have enough light to see someone else beside you. Because what is scary is not being alone in the dark, but it's not the dark, but feeling that you're alone. And then secondly, I said, from afar, people might say, oh, there's a group there. Maybe we can join them. Because I said, well, it's easier to join something that has started rather than starting it yourself. Then we went home. That was 69. Who would have thought that 70, there'd be the first quarter storm? We were not part of that at all. But the mood was there. So when it happened, we said, yeah, good. But we did not immediately say, oh, come on, but this is very radical, and it is Maoist, and calling for revolution. Where with the farmers, they're not calling for that, but we're frustrated ourselves. So we didn't immediately join. So again, it took us a while. And looking back then, I said that Christians who were politicized in a reform framework had three responses. Well, maybe four. The first one said, we want to be radical. We can't wait for Christianity. So they just jumped from being Christians, the church, their organization, and joined the secular Marxist-led youth organizations. They were still Christian, but they felt there's no room for Christian identity if you want to be radical. That's a minority. The next one was interesting, and these were mainly the Protestant youth. They said, Ed, we don't need you to decide to be radical. We have decided to be radicals. We believe that the national democratic position is better, it's needed, but it's led by Marxists. We want to be Christians. And when we want to join them, they tell us to stop being Christians. And we said, we want to be radical, but we also want to be Christian. And you're a theologian. So will you please explain how that will work? I was not a radical then. I felt the responsibility to tell them, yeah, you can do that. So people later said, was it theology of liberation? No. What I used was the political theology of Johann Baptist Metz. I'm trained by Germans. So where he had a very simple thing. He said, look, in the olden days, Christianity identified itself with one political option, mostly conservative, like Christian democracy or even feudalism. That's definitely wrong. You cannot identify Christian faith with one specific political option and say that's Christian, the rest are not. But you can swing to the opposite, kind of liberal Protestant tradition that says, well, all options are equally inadequate in the face of the kingdom of God and utopia. So they're all the same. And it says, no. What you should do is you must make a choice at any given time that is the most appropriate for this time, not forever. And his formulation was very typical, subtle, philosophical theology. We must make provisional but not arbitrary choices. So I told the Christian, okay, the National Democratic political line is your provisional but not arbitrary choice for this period of our history. But I was not part of them. I just gave them an explanation for decisions they had already made.
And it was coming from a Baptist, not from the Catholic liberation theology tradition.
No. Johann Baptist Metz is a Catholic theologian, German, but his theology is called political theology, not liberation theology. He was the contemporary of Jürgen Moltmann, who was the Protestant theology of hope. But this one was political theology. But these very mischievous young people, when I had left, they elected me to the National Council of the Student Christian Movement. So that was my first record, I think, with the military dossier saying, aha, Ed Dela Torre is a member of a radical organization.
The Student Christian
Movement.
Was that considered a radical organization at the time?
Yeah, in fact, they renamed themselves. They called them Kilusang Kristiyano ng Kabataang Pilipino, Christian Movement of Filipino Youth. And very explicit, we are aligned with radical movement, but we are Christians. So that's one. But the second response where Bobby was asking me, could you introduce some others, is the opposite. They also made a choice, what we used to call social democrat. They said, yeah, we have to make a choice. Cannot be conservative, but we don't want to be a national democrat. So they formulated their own line, and they call them social democracy. Strictly speaking, it's not. I think it's more like Christian democracy by European standards. But anyway, they made that. So they formed their own organization.
That was the PDSP.
PDSP, Lakas Diwa, Kasapi, and others. And of course, the National Democrats call them clerico-fascists. And then they would call the Christians crypto-communists. So Now, my position, myself personally, was I said, I'll not jump ahead of the Federation of Free Farmer Leaders and the Kiro Youth Activists. And so one was called Not Them, this one was called Suck Them. Our position was, why don't we let the people decide? And it was really a cop out because we couldn't decide ourselves. So they used to call us, let them, let them decide. And it took a while. That was 70. They made their decision together because our idea is, let's not break our ranks. If we make a decision, let's do it together. And if it takes time, fine. So those who were impatient just left. But we said, if we go in, we will go in with our big group. And that became, we opted for national democracy maybe just a couple of months before the declaration of martial law. So when martial law was declared, we were already national democrats. But it was not like the others, no? That's why we're still grappling with the same thing with the students. How are you radical? And, not just because you're jumping into something shouted by the students on the street, led by the Communist Party, advocating armed struggle. I mean, we knew that was part of the package, but what is the distinct Christian contribution, identity, things like that. So it took a while. That was what, maybe from the first quarter of 70, it's 1 year, 71, and up to. So I feel personally, looking back, that it was a more solidly grounded and mature decision because it was not on the spur of the moment, just joining what is, if not fashionable, because radicals have an interesting skill at making people who cannot be radical feel guilty. There must be something wrong with you. And of course, when you're young, you're vulnerable to that. But the thing that is later, you realize it isn't really solidly grounded in having thought through. That is why I feel most of those people who were with me, just as myself, whatever happened to the movement later or the church later, we said, we thought through our options. No, the only difference is the conditions changed. See, when I was during my second imprisonment, I was held at the Camp Bago Bantay. It has been closed now because that was reserved for what they call national leaders. And camp commander was then Colonel Galileo Quintanar, who did his, I don't know, was it a National Defense College thesis on contemporary religious radicalism in the Philippines. He was the one trying to understand how come Christians became radical. And sometimes he would ask the guard to open because we are locked in at 9 o'clock in our individual cells, bring me to his office, serve me coffee, and to have a conversation. It was kind of a subtle interrogation, but at some point, he was saying, what do you think? Why do people like you become radical? And I told him, Colonel, you might not believe it, but I personally tell you, we might be radical in our speech, ready to stand up, but we would prefer to be reformers, except maybe when we were very, very young and want to be martyrs, no? But those are youthful martyr complexes. The more normal priest, nun, wants to be significant, wants to help the poor, but within the system, and kind of just shake it, push it maximum to its possibilities rather than breaking it up and overthrowing it. But because I said that's the driver within us. But then two things happened. I said, martial law pushed and restricted the space for reforms. So reforms closed. Now, if the left, the National Democratic Front, also pushed and say, no place in the movement for Christians, will be squeezed in the middle and will either be passive, migrate, and all that. No? But what happened is the NDF developed a policy of pulling us into the movement, saying, welcome, we'll have a broad front. You don't have to be a communist to be a radical. So I said, you put the push and the pull together, and internally so you have us. So he said, we agree. So he would use that later in intelligence briefing. We must not have too much push factor. Allow them some space. But of course, he had no control over the other side, and which is what I did later. He said, well, I helped not only explain theoretically, but helped in organizing and guiding fellow Christians, church people to say, look, this is a secular movement. It is Marxist-led. It's not our traditional space for witness and apostolate, but given the circumstances, what do we do? So in that sense, when people say, did you invent theology because you're a theologian? Did you develop a Filipino liberation theology? I said, maybe I did, but what I did actually was not so much the theology, but I enabled people who were Christians, but who were already being pushed and pulled to make radical choices, and I gave them kind of explanations to understand, to justify, to feel at ease with the choices they made. So in that sense, I said, okay, I feel guilty. I'm guilty. And I remember one time a retired Irish missionary whom I met in Ireland said, Ed, don't you ever feel guilty that there are young people whom you have influenced and some of them got killed, some of them got imprisoned or even tortured? Don't you feel guilty and responsible? I said, I should, but on the other hand, I would feel more guilty if I didn't undergo the detention myself. You push people into something you don't do yourself. But the other, which I think is more important, I said, well, maybe your question reflects a kind of a paternalistic notion of how priests and teachers influence students. I said, did we influence? Definitely. Was their decision their own? Definitely. So, if you believe in their decision and they achieve something, you can share a bit in the achievement, but don't take it from them. So, vice versa, I said. They went eyes wide open into a movement with all its danger and all that. I get angry, I get sad. I start asking myself, what's my role? These people got killed too young, got imprisoned. But I said, in the end, they made a decision. And I think that's the key. If you trace the core of any liberation theology, it is that the belief that people whom you would otherwise feel are powerless to change not just their lives but a system have the potential to do that, but they must be critical, they must organize, they must have leadership. So in that sense, so that the expression of the same Christian faith of, if you put it in traditional terms, how do I live out being a creature of God, a son of God, follower of Christ, you translate it, no, do something about your situation. It's not God's will that you remain poor, and you should not fight just for yourself but for others who are victims of injustice, and it's not enough to denounce and maybe take revenge on oppressors who are benefiting. No, the system is a problem, and that one doesn't come from theology. Now you have to bring in all kinds of literature, including Marxist analysis, structural analysis, in addition to that, you want to change it. How do you change that? So I think people oversimplify when they say, it must be liberation theology. It's one influence because it allowed us to link what is otherwise secular, strange, non-Christian sources to biblical and theological language and put that together and apply to the Philippine situation. But theologically, I had time to read because when I was arrested, I led a hunger strike, and after we won, at least in terms of some investigation happened, I was put in solitary confinement. And so I said, can I read books? And they said, no, political books. Theology? I said, yeah. So I got all the theology books from the seminary. So for the first time in my life, I had a personal seminar on all the Latin American theologians. Juan Luis Segundo, 5 volumes I read twice. So in a sense, I learned theology of liberation explicitly after I had already got involved. The bridge for me was partly political theology and just my own personal. And that's why people ask me, and when will you ever write your theology book? I said, I might eventually write, except now it's something else again. It's post-martial law. It's not revolution. The theology of liberation in a restored, ambiguous democracy still dominated by the elite.
And it's not, what was the term that Baptist had? Provisional, but not arbitrary.
Yeah. So now another situation. What is the next provisional but not arbitrary choice? Some people, even in the activist movement, would rather stick with what they had and hope that the situation adjusts to it. I think some people will even say, they will declare martial law. I think they half wish he would. Then your analysis doesn't have to change because the situation resembles the one that the analysis you developed and the strategy you advocated during martial law. But for me, even if it gets formally declared, it's different this time. Secondly, the appeal of the strategy of a protracted people's war and underground and communist leadership, it has its appeal, but not the kind of appeal it had in 1970, where it was the most forthright, courageous, and sacrificing. Now people will say, first of all, the left has split. So which left? And secondly, but they joined Duterte forever. Now they're fighting. Whom do we follow now? Who has the consistent moral and political stand? Not in terms of the narrow politics of do you like the president or not, or what is the structure you want to change? And how do you change it? And who will change it? Is it the few activists willing to sacrifice yourself or run for office? What about the empowerment of the people? And what is their consciousness? Some are for him, some are against him. So it is a new challenge, not only in terms of analysis, but even now, what is you want to invoke and use your understanding of faith and Bible and Christianity as a guide? Now, what expression does that have right now in this situation? And you ask me often, I wouldn't, but it doesn't mean that I'll remain agnostic or just partial. It's just that there cannot be too easy and premature certainty about what is the right thing to do. Not personally, with some it can be easier. Take my risk. But if you want to help guide, communities, organizations, institutions. So like, for example, I'm helping now the National Secretariat for Social Action, which is the social action arm of the Catholic Church. They're developing a new leadership course for social action staff and leaders. But my lecture is scheduled late this year for November. And the whole issue, Ed, lead us into what the method used in early 70s about pastoral analysis. Before it used to be see, judge, act, data, judgment, action. But the pastoral cycle now is more complex. It says data first, then you do analysis. But after analysis, you do interpretation of what is the stand, because the analysis does not yield automatically the stand you will take. And this will be guided now by your values, including your faith, and then action. So they said, would you lead us? First of all, help us do the tools, because some people jump from data, could be case, an example, and jump to action. And that is valid if it's did, but after a while, you said, others get lost in the analysis because the data is never enough and never lead to action, or think that analysis is not mediated by judgment and choice. They think it's like almost like an engineering or logical proposition. So this is analysis, that is the action. And of course, in real life, it's not linear. Sometimes you already had some emotional, personal choice. Then you try to justify it by an analysis and all that. So I think right now, I like that pastoral cycle thing. And when I've been giving talks to some, they said, oh, Ed, that's good. First of all, it's safely developed within the Catholic tradition. So, because before they say, all the analysis of all these Christians, they are just warmed over Marxist tools, which you add a theological gloss, nothing that emerged from our own. And I think this one is close. I think this was started by Center for Concern by some Jesuits in Washington long, long ago. But it has been kind of rediscovered and revived. And I quite like it because, first of all, it tells you that you have to keep generating data. It's never complete, but you don't have to wait until you get all the data, and data includes subjectivity. What is your attitude? How do you feel? But then you analyze. Now, what do you use? Structural analysis. And right now, of course, people say, oh, what does that mean? And then what about the value? The values against which you use the data and the analysis to make a choice. And then what is the expression of that in terms of action, including with whom will you act? Because you never act by yourself. So I think right now, that is where the new, call it theology, appropriate for this time, that could fill Johann Baptist Metz's advice. You cannot avoid making a choice saying, we don't know, they're all the same. You must make a choice. Which one is closer to what is more moral, more effective? But remember, it's provisional. Don't make it dogmatic, but it's not arbitrary. Of course, someone says, that's a very nice guideline for intellectuals. Because when you make a choice, will you say, I remember someone told me, Ed, shall I say, look, I'm a man and there are many women. I cannot say this one is it and perfect. I cannot also say, they're more or less the same. You say, I will make a provisional but not arbitrary choice. What do you think? My girlfriend will say, I love you, not arbitrarily, but provisionally. And so one nun said, Ed, the intellectual process might have that. But once you commit everything. So I said, that's the challenge. How do you commit everything to something that is not everything?
So how did you feel first encountering the Marxist model? And did you have qualms that it wasn't kind of a provisional framework?
No, in my case, it was very unique because he was anti-communist, Remes Montemayor, but his concept was, hey, we should understand our enemy. And here is not Marxism, it's Mao Zedong thought. So actually, he said, Ed, let us understand Maoism and explain it to others to kind of inoculate them against it. So we had we reprinted our own essays of Mao Zedong on contradiction, on practice, the Chinese Revolution, and all that, and explained it to others. And said, this is their strategy. And I remember teaching once in a girls' college, and the reaction was, but sir, it sounds so logical. What is our answer? And that's why I said, yeah, we don't have an overall. And so that's why when it came, the problem was more like if the Maoists become sectarian and dogmatic, you will react. In fact, I feel personally, my radicalism got postponed simply because of the ones who represented it. Their attitude toward people like us is surrender. Finally, you admit you've been wrong. So surrender, and therefore now you're second-class radicals. Listen to us, we were the first. There's that kind of attitude. So yeah, I mean, analytically, it made sense during that period. In the same way that towards the end, and especially after EDSA, I was using as very similar tools, but arriving at another position. Because, by the way, structural analysis, which is a variation of Marxist analysis, but the French model, Althusserian, was actually taught in the Philippines by, what's his name? The one studied with him in Belgium, Francois Hutar. He came here and he was, and a lot of people like it. It talks of structures, then you have a dominant class, you have a dominated class, and in between you have an auxiliary class. So it's perfect for we're the auxiliary class, and if you're conservative, you are the servant class of the powers that be. But then in the future, if the dominating class become politicized and organized, we are still a servant class because you're middle class. You're not really the heroes of a revolution, but at least you serve now. We used to say, now the powers that be, and in the future, we will be the servant of the powers that will be. It's only later when you broaden the alliances, the notion of civil society came in, almost to the point where now, it's kind of almost conventional wisdom. It's actually the middle classes who will, at least if not the main, will lead. Some of the Marxists in the UP as a thesis that in all these years, in the name of the workers and in the name of the farmers, the leadership of the left was middle class, and not in terms of status, maybe even thinking, which is part, I really personally accept part of that. That's the reason why later my own field of work is popular education, so that the theoretical, more coherent, informed by book ideas should be translated into ideas and language understood by the people. That's one direction. And the other is that their own popular consciousness, that we should help them to theorize that. And my metaphor for that was, it's like we are birds, we theorize, we fly around, we can chase our ideas. We look at the fish and you say, why are they not moving? But I said, the fish will say, you're so far up there, why don't you plunge down here and swim with us? And when you're here, you realize, oh, they're moving, although it's slow. But then afterwards, I said, you cannot then fly out and claim, oh, I'm a bird, but I swam with the fish. So you're now this expert sociologist, anthropologist. I said, let's identify some of the fish and teach them to fly. So instead of just telling stories about, this is my personal story, can't they theorize a bit? So for me, whether it's farmers or workers or urban poor, middle class, secondary, it's a relative thing. When I go to the rural area, they are the fish, I am the bird. When they come here to Manila, I am the fish, they are the birds. The outsider is the bird, but with an overview. That's the meaning of theory. The fish are the ones who swim on day to day. But then, if you are a bird, you must learn to swim. And if you're a fish, you must learn to fly. And you put it all together somehow. And someone kind of even wrote, I think, a thesis on that about the relationship between grassroots leaders and the cadres, whether political cadre or NGO cadre, development cadre, or for that matter, the clergy is a cadre group. The basic Christian community leader is a grassroots leader.
At the Vince Boudreau.
Yeah, that's Vince, about BSIG and... but in my case, what I like, something raised by, I don't know whether it's the Boff brothers in Brazil. I read a book or an article written by them long time ago where it says, theology has three forms. There's professional theology, which is what Latin America is better known for because they write books with footnotes. The Philippines, you don't have any like that for a long while. But then there is pastoral theology, which is expressed in sermons and liturgies. And there is popular theology expressed in hymns and practices. Now, it's not a hierarchical thing that professional is real and pastoral is kind of polluted and popular has to be sorted out. No, there are three different expressions of an attempt to understand the meaning of what my life is and the meaning of choices I made vis-a-vis the faith I either grew up with, believed without fully understanding it, or maybe learned catechism. So for me, I think right now, all three are happening. Some are emerging as popular theology or popular politics, which right now can swing to the extreme of populist, negative almost. Then you have the other, which is very theoretical, well reasoned out, aware of related literature, but very often is restricted to a fairly narrow or academic. And then there's the pastoral, which is expressed in like whole debate. What is the theology expressed by the Black Nazarene? Is that superstition? Is that something, But for me, the closest like basic Christian communities, that's popular theology. It's explicitly informed by some biblical studies, some liturgy. So I think something like that is also happening in the kind of broadly progressive or left circles. There is such a thing as a professional left. They know the literature, draw from Marx, etc., etc. Then there is the pastoral, which is applied, the organizers and all that. And there is the popular, meaning I used to say, I like the hyphenation of progressive, popular, popular, progressive. Progressive means it's theorized, it's clear, but then the question is how to make it popular. Well, the other is you start with what is popular and tease out what's progressive in that. Both are valid. No? The second one is harder when you believe that progressive comes from the outside because the popular is dominated by the ruling ideas. When it's rather than saying, no, it's all mixed up there. There is actually some resistance within taking maybe inarticulate forms, kind of silence, maybe some joke, some resentment. There's some utopian ideas. Maybe, I don't know. It's a whole mix. And the role of intellectuals, leaders, whatever, is to help distill, clarify, check against evidence-related literature literature and all that. I think that's the task right now. Well, I count myself among them. So the only question is which forum and which form do I choose? Do I write a theoretical book? Do I write popular pamphlets? Do I engage in dialogical discussions with different people? I can do all three, but the question is where do I want to focus? You ask me right now, my personal choice would still be, if I had the time, the resources, and the links, I would still want to concentrate on developing community grassroots leaders who not only know their local situation, but who can link their local to the larger discourse. And that's the kind of work I do when I move around. It's just to those who are already there, exercising some form of leadership, and then they're curious, oh, Ed, you're in Manila. What's the latest news? What's your analysis of the government? Things like that.
How did you approach these questions in '72 how did you start moving towards the formation of the CNL, where some of these ideas took on organizational form?
Now, CNL was formed before martial law. I said when there were when they let them and the not them converged, we talked. I said we need our own institutional space. It was not meant to be a distinct kind of fighting organization, but saying we don't have a place where you can be at ease saying I'm radical and I'm Christian, and I'm Christian, I'm radical. Because the SOCDEM says, if you are Christian, you cannot be National Democrat. And the Marxists say, if you are National Democrat, you cannot be Christian. And they might not express it, but emotionally and intellectually. So we said, oh, let's form our own Christians for National Liberation. That was very explanatory because I said, why not Christians for National Democracy? Well, there's a lot of liberation. It's very arbitrary. So it's to allude, because we could have called ourselves Christians for National Democracy. Why not? I told them, I like liberation because that's theological. So it was without order or without permission of the party. We just organized. But I'm sure there were party members among us. I don't know what they reported. And I don't know what would have happened if martial law wasn't declared. We could have evolved into a distinct Christian but radical movement in tandem with a more secular Marxist-led movement. But martial law comes and says, "Poop! You're all the same." So there was not much thinking, who's Christian, who's Marxist, but how do you survive? Do you surrender? Do you lie low? Do you fight? For the first, and that's where the advantage, I think, came of the early formulation by the NDF, because they had a preset answer that made sense when the situation happened. There's no room for reform. There will be no election. There is repression. Oh, there we should have armed struggle. I myself, my first impulse, National Democrat. I go home to Mindoro and take up arms in my home island. It's for us. Even Jose Jokno sent word from prison. He says, Ed, make sure that these hothead young people will not get massacred by having stupid uprising in the city. And told him, no way, because there is this dominant left thinking, you want armed, go to the countryside. In the urban, go underground, do propaganda, who can wait eventually. So for us, it was a very kind of a broad path was already laid. Except in my case, if that happened, by the way, you wouldn't be interviewing me. You'll be interviewing someone else on how I was killed in '72. Because the few young Christians who went there on their own, they all got massacred.
They went to
Mindoro.
Mindoro, yeah.
To start a guerrilla group, but they were not part of the NPA. They called themselves NPA, but they came from the propaganda movement. So from the mountains, they were sending leaflets to the town. And then what happened, we learned later, because some of them were very good personal friends, that when the Scout Ranger, an equivalent to special forces of the military, have finished their training, they have a test mission for graduation. They became the test mission. Stood no chance. Very, very well trained. They had no commander who knew. So a few survived. Many were killed. I would have been part of them because I would have joined them. But then some other people said, Ed, you stay here in Manila and you are now going to do two things. You help establish the National Democratic Front. You work with Dr. Prudente and all that, Saturo Campo and others. And secondly, you regroup all those Christians who are willing to be part of the struggle but who cannot go. Those who want to go to the country, let them go there. But those here who will work in the institutions, the urban areas, you work. So that's what my work was here.
So you were really there in the beginning of the NDF.
Yeah, the preparatory. Well, it's called the preparatory committee, but I'd say these are all practically either all already party members and leaders. But the idea is we will reach out. So I started reaching out to people. We were not recruiting them into the underground or the party. We're just telling them, look, we have to have this broad alliance, and it is called the National Democratic Front. This is very tentative programs. So my focus was, I remember I called it CPC, Committee for the Participation of Christians. I move around. I remember I was the editor editor of only 2 issues of Pilipinas, which are underground newsletter.
I was going to ask you about that as well. How did this magazine get started? How was it part of, I guess, CNL? And did it relate to like the Science of the Times? Some of the
No, it's different. This is underground. So this is like if the Communist Party had Ang Bayan and eventually the NDF had Liberation, we had Pilipinas. And of course, we were very few. We were on the run. In fact, I distinctly remember we were in an apartment somewhere in Manila. I was going to write not an article, an editorial. So I was leafing through an old issue of the Sunday Times magazine, and then I saw on one page, oh, this is interesting. It's like an old photograph of Filipino soldiers with their rifles posing before doing battle with the Americans. The next page, they were all piled on a heap, dead bodies with the Americans in front. At that moment, I tell people, I felt almost like a mystical connection. I said, these people couldn't have imagined. It was 19 that I would be continuing their struggle, which failed. So I said, maybe it's a good consoling thought that whatever happens to me, whatever happens to us, another generation will continue our struggle. But let's give them a better chance than this guy got us because we haven't read anything from them. So for me, that whole idea that at some point, someone will pick up if the situation remains needing to be changed, and we as a people, there will always some people who will come up. But if you can write a few things that can be a bridge, a link, so maybe that's the role of especially those of us who are getting older to say, at least leave behind whatever you have done, whatever writings you can do. You can be more conscious about choosing whom to nurture and groom and inspire. But who knows? If you take history on a larger scale, you can see that at some point the people in broad sense always get underestimated. Just when you thought they were all passive and never given up, some of them rise again. Except they always fail because if it is not thought through and if it's not guided by some strategy, obviously then it's inspiring. But in the end, when the energy is dissipated, like all this springs, then the conservative forces reconsolidate and people say, my point is, this is an internet meme, like, don't feel sad that it ended. Be happy it happened. Which is for me, if you let's say, granting that there is an end to the social phenomenon of a consciously radical Christian section of a revolution, granting it has ended, do you just feel sad? No. You should be happy it started, it happened. And the next question is lessons for the next situation where we might again be responsibly pushed to making a radical choice as a provisional but not arbitrary choice. So,
you mentioned Diokno communicating with Diokno in prison. What was the relationship of the movement that you were a part of in building to Diokno and like the older generation of Philippine nationalists like Claire Recto?
No, there is in the mid-60s, there was a resurgence of nationalist sentiments. And it was starting first among the intellectuals and the elite. And they would be represented from Diokno, especially Renato Constantino, who wrote a lot. And so in a sense, that's from Recto to this. It's like elite nationalism, except I think particularly in Diokno's case, there is also a kind of a popular element because a lawyer for justice. In fact, Renato Constantino used to say, the left just used me like elementary studies. When they graduate, they read Jose Maria Sison. It's like when he says, I'm actually the more brilliant. He is too pedantic, and that's textbook type. So yes, because this is part of national democracy. So any group intellectual who believes at the very least in a more independent Philippines, either directed against America or Japan or China, whatever, as part of, except at some point, I think the National Democratic Movement tended to emphasize the democratic social part, and the national part is like, we have to accommodate some of this nationalist elite. But they're not really very reliable because they're also elite. But Diokno was very respected by the NDF, no? Except he was also he had one time, in fact, if my mother could have her way, the first time I was released from prison, her dream was that I should be the political secretary of Jose Diokno because that would keep me safe from the NDF. And Diokno told me, Ed, because he knows I was in the NDF, Ed, you better teach your cadre to be more clever. After 20 minutes, I know, no matter how clever, who is a member of the NDF. Why? You have a favorite adjective which you all use. What's that? Genuine democracy. Once someone says genuine, I know he is a member of the National Democratic Movement. Well, of course, the Social Democrats, they have a favorite word, authentic. That's it too. Genuine. The same. True. But genuine is so anything that is, that's the genuine one is the one that is based on the masses, led by the party. Authentic is it's humanist, it's not too drawn by class. So these are two, you might call it, diagnostic words. It's always a shortcut. Authentic humanism is the tradition of social democracy, which ironically It should not be. That could be ours. And genuine nationalism, genuine democracy, genuine United Front, genuine agrarian reform, genuine. There's a usage. And Jokno was very wise to say, I am an Ed, you know.
How are the NatDems and the, I guess, the nationalists like Jokno, the progressives, and the SOCDEMs interfacing with each other? At what point did that start to happen?
Well, the more, I used to say, you know, the broader Marcos repressed, people are forced to work together, no? And especially towards the 80s. And part of it is also necessity, but also maturation, you know. At the beginning, you know, everyone's sectarian at the beginning. But slowly they talk. I mean, there was a lot. When that's the second time, just before I was arrested the second time, I was again part of the project to build the National Democrat. This time, it was genuine, meaning there were people there invited who were not members of the Communist Party. We talked to the April 6 Liberation Movement, that's a social democratic group. The Dong Menso is a Marxist, but not a member of the Communist Party. We had Felix Bento Olalia was a trade union leader, but not a member of the... So it was starting to broaden. And when, of course, there's talk, okay, if you can remove Marcos, who'll take over? Do you simply want the return of the old elite? You should have at least a broader one. And the left would say, if not us, at least get Tañado there, get Jokno there, and all that. In fact, some people were saying that the US have supported Cory and lent its way to removing Marcos if the coalition government did not marginalize Tañada and Jokno and all that, which was partly because the left boycotted. Meaning, for all the talk of the US about wanting to remove Marcos and having a truly representative government, but not too left and not too nationalist. So it's a trade-off. Like, you want their help, so you have to diminish your project. But if you want to remain what you are, but you will not get their help. It is a real issue.
You mentioned you were in prison. Were you out of prison by the time the boycott started to happen, 78?
No, I was in prison all the time. So, but you know...
How were you when were you first imprisoned, and how did that happen?
I should have been superstitious. Friday the 13th, December 1974. And then I was imprisoned in a couple of 3, 4, 5, released April 1980 on condition I should leave the Philippines and go to Rome to study theology. Then I returned after a year, got arrested again. Then I was released, EDSA. So in a way, but except for the initial where you are in isolation, interrogation and all that, later I spent more time in prison where there was access visitors. So from within, we were taking part in the debate and the discussion outside, although technically the policy in the movement and the party then was, once you're in prison, you don't have any official position. So your influence is as good as your ideas. It's in that context where, in a way, I knew what was happening. Part of it was fresh news by people who were freshly arrested. So, which you always like because we were tired already of each other's faces. We were always looking forward to the next batch of arrested people. We'll have fresh stories.
As you were monitoring these attempts at coalition building during the elections and the boycotts that were happening, I guess 78 is a big one. Then I guess 84 is a big one. What were the conversations?
Well, we were outliers, kind of. And people would say, yeah, maybe because they're in prison. Because our whole point is, remember, our project was building a broadest alliance. We said, look, don't have all this premature kind of jockeying for power. The main target is anyone who's against Marcos. If they're contributing, I have a place for them. No? And don't immediately play out your rivalry on who will lead, who will be more dominant. It's not peculiar to the National Democrats. Everyone had his own agenda. I guess we were like seen as kind of like slightly out of the action elderly people giving advice. Except that towards the 84, we could write stuff and people outside would publish them anonymously. So I remember that I had Plaridel papers. That's when we post. I remember when the upsurge against Marcos after Ninoy was killed came, and people were saying, including the journalists, where is this going? From the National Democrats' point of view, it's simple. This will be an addition to the protracted People's War, but Marcos will not simply go away. He'll resist up to the very end. My metaphor is in the imagination of the National Democrats. The fall of Marcos is a 12-part telenovela. And on the last episode, Marcos falls and the red flag is over Malacanang. But what happens, on the 6th episode, Marcos fell. And not only was the red flag not there, they were kicking out the red. Because many of the red say, it should be boycott. So it's a dilemma. The strategy of a protracted people and revolution did not have a place for Marcos being replaced by an elite democracy. And that is partly true because Laurel and others really were thinking of, we will restore democracy as it was before martial law. That's where the difference was with Jokno and others. They said, no, we want something more than that. Not left, but more than that. So they were saying, we must force Marcos to resign. And there was this subtle debate again. Oh, the left will say, that's too passive. There is no agency. Resign. Oust. So they hear this
Semantic
sometimes
differences.
nitpick. Do you resign or oust? And by then you will know who is there. And we were saying, okay, you can discuss that. What will replace? And they said, oh, not traditional politics. But it's not the revolution. So what do we call it? I remember that time telling Boy Morales, Boy, in marketing, when you don't know what to call something, just call it new. So our first proposition, we want new politics. What that is, we do not know. But new, not the old, which looking back later could hit both ways. Not the old elite, but the old left politics. New. But then journalists said, come on, give us something more than new. What will replace? Because we were still thinking it's a coalition government, but it will not be led by the left. But hopefully it includes the left. So what do you call that? That's when we coined popular democracy. And the origin of that's interesting. I don't know how. An article? I don't even know. Was it an article? Something Xerox was brought to prison? Was it a book on the Nicaraguan Revolution? And when they won, the Sandinistas won. Remember, the first government included the widow of Chamorro. The opposition was killed. So Violeta Chamorro, but dominated by the Sandinistas. And Tomas Borge, one of the commandantes, was asked by a journalist, possibly a progressive journalist from the left, saying, Comandante, what do you call your government? Is this socialist? Is this what? And he threw away. It's a government of popular democracy. I told him, that's our name. So we gave him as the POPDEMs, popular democracy. So we moved from let them to not them to pop them. And even later, we said, now what is it exactly? So we said, now what did we mean by that? So we said, no, it's a broader thing. It cannot be only the elite and the left is illegitimized. But it cannot also be, at this point, led by the left. So that's why we said, it should be like a rainbow. That's my joy. It's a rainbow and there is no rainbow without red. Except I said, my left comrades want the rainbow. It's mainly red with a few token colors. So I said, it turned out it's mainly yellow with a little there. So that's one. Secondly, but that's the broadening. The other is, it cannot be only representative democracy. There should be forms of participatory democracy. Not necessarily direct democracy, kind of semi-anarchistic. So slowly over time, that became the theorization. And within that, I said, well, my location, I could be part of state government leader, but that's not my preferred location. I prefer to be located outside the formal institutions of power to help build other institutions of people power. At that time, we were thinking of people's councils. I mean, there was even some discussion. What is the form if that is the government and the people are not just undifferentiated mass or loose but institutionalized? One form is like a people's council that interfaces, which later Jesse Robredo acknowledged as a direct inspiration when he legislated in Naga City, the Naga City People's Council, where the POs and NGOs were formally recognized by legislation to form committees parallel to the city councils. So they were not elected, but they were also not just token. In fact, the people elected in the council said, these people will replace us in the future if we allow them to too many meetings, which happened. But then weakened the People's Council because no one replaced them there. So for me, that's still I think, a legit issue. I mean, will people power simply be represented by genuine representatives? Will there not be direct participation? First of all, participation, which can there not be also non-government and non-state embodiments of people power? That's the kind of thinking that we were exploring from within, and then when we got out, we got identified with that stream.
So the POPDEM idea is something that emerges in the early 80s,
Mid-80s.
mid 80s, but pre-EDSA.
Oh, yeah. It's the period where, in addition to coalition work, where we were associated, to talk, how do you have greater democracy short of what we thought was the best democracy, which would be a revolutionary one, and not settle for just more of the same old rotation of the elite. So it's not even liberal democracy in this, although we think liberal democracy is integral to that. No? So there was one time we said, maybe it's a hybrid of liberal and radical democracy. It's popular democracy. Because, people in the left, that's an interesting usage. If it's the basic sector, you call them the masses. When you say people, it includes the middle class. And in the national democratic tradition, it includes the patriotic elite, because people in the left is not a biological term. It's a political term. The opposite of people is enemies of the people.
It's the United Front.
Yeah, but people is more than the masses.
When you were introducing this idea, how did it differ from the radical Maoist or Marxist
Well, because
conception.
in theory, CPP talks of a coalition government, but for them, a coalition is something they dominate, and the seemingly non-communists are actually secretly communist-led. So you say, come on, let's not fool ourselves. Secondly, it will only be established, logically so, in their thinking, through a final armed settlement. I think it will not be done by some negotiated peace settlement. So together with the model of what can be established is the model also of how it can be established. So I really still think at that moment it was possible, because in the left tradition, which is still my own self and critique to the rest of the left, we cannot conceptualize a coalition where we are minorities and yet significant. The idea of the left is if you are minority, you are insignificant and marginalized. The only way it can be a real coalition if you not only lead it but dominate it, which explains why they're very poor at alliance work. Because what happens is, in name, it's an alliance, but you do all the work. So you start saying, why do we need them? We're doing all the work anyway, just additional meetings. And I said, in the underground, it was difficult because anyone who was committed to difficult, dangerous underground armed struggle, sooner or later, will be recruited to the NPA and the party. And that made sense when there is no open space. But when the space opens and there is election and all that, some of these are better than you. Now, the best coalition is when you respect that someone else can contribute something you cannot, and you need each other. And that's why I felt the condition for a working coalition is when the transition is not an uprising, but a combination of mass action, elections, protests, and all that.
So you could already foresee that there would be an electoral, I guess.
No, at the beginning, we thought it wouldn't happen. But 82, when I came back from Europe, 81, ironically, I thought I was kind of brilliant. I had exposed myself to Europe. There were people within the party who were saying, Ed, I think election has more power over the imagination of our people. And maybe we should, and the urban areas are more important than we thought, not just the rural, So they called them 10 theses, which I couldn't retrieve because they said, hey, this is unofficial, but it's our discussion. The Philippines maybe is a little bit more capitalist than we thought. The urban areas are bigger and more important than we thought. Therefore, the middle class is more important than we thought. And elections have reforms, and the religion. And they said, oh my God, he said, looking back, you put all five, and that's EDSA.
Edgar Jobson was talking about this already in the early 80s.
The three strategic combinations. Yeah. And that was, as far as we know, I wasn't there. Just like it was a kind of a central committee meeting sometime in 80 or 81. Because Marcos lifted martial law, the mass movement was growing. So my guess, they read the situation based on. So I heard it for the first time either late 81, I had already returned, or early 82 before I was arrested. That's why when we were doing our work with I knew that I was not a complete maverick. That this was not unique to people like us. There were people who were thinking within the national democratic tradition that there might be variations.
Did Jobson's perspective lose? It lost. It lost out, obviously, but
part of it is, I think, personally, power dynamics within the party.
It wasn't about debate and the best idea.
There was, but at some point, well, part of it, some of them get killed, some of them get arrested. As far as I know, but this is now hearsay, not personal knowledge, that some of it was that some of those espousing these ideas, not us, because we were not a threat, we were not in the active leadership, we're seen as maybe possibly challengers to those in the leadership who were ensuring that the line of protracted people's war will not be compromised, and we're into some favorite word of the left, some opportunistic, short-term tactical advantage where you will lose your strategic bearings for the sake of some immediate tactical advantage.
So they were pushed out of positions of power.
And not only that, meaning literally the people who were going to do that were disciplined. We heard that they were reassigned by saying, you're too lax and too accommodating.
How about the CNL? What happens to the CNL during this period?
CNL, the good news and the bad news about the CNL. The good news is, first of all, CNL rapidly expanded. I was surprised. In 81, I was back here already. I'm not sure if it's 81 or 82. I managed to attend the underground National Congress of the CNL, the second one. This time, this was party-led. The first one was not. But when I met people, my gosh, I knew only 1/3 of them. So I said, the good news, I knew only 1/3. Because if I still knew all of them, that means the CNL did not expand. But if I knew next to no one, that means all the old CNL have retired, moved on. But I knew 1/3. But what happened is CNL expanded in other areas because the party itself, the activists said, well, if you are a church person, if you are a Christian, we have an organization for you, CNL. So people thought we're terrific organizers because we're spread all over the Philippines. No, it was because the movement as a whole said CNL is the organizational expression of people in the Christian tradition. And that's the reason why I think soon after that, the attempt to develop a theology of struggle, it was seen as legit now, not the old party saying, your Christian and faith is something that is the remnant of your conservative past. When you become scientific, that will all go. For whatever reason, they said, no, it seems this is real, so we better just give it an actual space. Just make sure it doesn't challenge party leadership or go away, you know. So in that sense, the CNL was, but except because some were very good cadres, when the secular, maybe Marxist cadres got arrested, got killed, or failed in their work in United Front or urban work with us, CNL people would be asked to fill. So they were CNL formally, but they were not helping strengthen CNL. That's why we had to create. I remember I was in the car. We'll call them CNL on special assignment because their assignment was not inside the church and inside. It was really party assignment. Normally, United Front, legal, finance, and all that. So in that sense, by that strength became a weakness when the debates happened.
How so?
Because, well, there was a time, especially after EDSA, CNL, I don't know whether they told you about that, there was a group in CNL who said, we will maintain the integrity position, meaning we will not be drawn into the split between the reaffirm and the reject. Integrity. It couldn't hold because the reaffirm people who were very loyal to the party said, we own CNL, we have the franchise.
So in a way, there was a closure of that.
Yeah.
Space,
for example, right now,
space.
I think maybe in the official documents of CNL, maybe my role is not even there, or maybe I'll be denounced as a heretic or as a deviant or what. It's sad because I feel the position is proper, meaning, okay, we are working with Marxists, but we had our own identity. So why can't we be, ideally, we could have been kind of maybe bridge builder. I mean, you know, which is really what even in this whole debate, I said, why should you? There are more things that can unite us than divide us. Why are you emphasizing? In fact, right now, when people say, you know, when we were the cadres, if you are not a revolutionary, you could still be considered an ally. And some allies are very good allies, some are not so reliable allies, but allies nonetheless. How come now, if you're not a revolutionary, you're a counter-revolutionary? Where did that thinking emerge?
In a way, reading Joel Rockamore's book, Breaking Through It, I got the sense that the split really kind of happened because
92.
of, well, number one, the relationship between the party and civil society isn't fully theorized. But then you have
Well, first of all, civil society as a term never existed, I think, in party literature until much later, and very often as a kind of a liberal bourgeois invention or a Socdem-dominated one. So I don't know.
But then how did they think of or theorize the relationship between the underground and the National Democratic Front, above and beyond a marriage of convenience or a shield for the underground?
No, that's why I said Ed Yop's formulation of 3 strategic combinations I felt was crucial for anyone who can read. I used to read party literature like papal encyclicals, you know. Lost in the usual verbiage are some key changes. See, when you say 3 strategic, before it's underground is strategic, legal is tactical, rural is strategic, urban is tactical, home front is strategic, international so strategic, tactical, strategic. But when you say 3 strategic combinations, first of all, somebody, how can there be 2? But on the other, when you say strategic, that means it's long term, it's important, and you don't put second-rate cadres there who cannot go to the principal one. In fact, you must develop people there who are very as good, maybe eventually if you had an in elections and legal as they are in arms. But no, the idea before is sooner or later, if you're good and you want to rise, you must go to where the principal arena is for the most dedicated, the most skilled. That for me is, and in certain situations, it made sense. No, you didn't want to have too many people doing work in an arena that was not significant. But I think that's where, in a sense, the accumulation of work of the underground and legal and the lifting, just partial lifting of martial law, opened the space. And within that, and that's where non-national democratic forces flourished because they had no underground. They could concentrate there. Well, the national democratic cadres were in a dilemma because some of them on their own, but they will be pulled back with, it's too much, or recruit them and push them here. So that's because, again, the thinking, and that's nothing bad or narrow, because the thinking is, this will not be a really significant arena for political change. So accumulate forces where, I remember that we were already joking, oh, in the national democratic imagination, what will be the role of the urban areas? And people will say, oh, maybe when the new People's Army tanks roll into Manila, we will be waving flags to welcome it. It's like, you're so passive. You're not going to. And for me, even the metaphor, the image of shield and spear, tells you that. It's the spear that kills and wounds. The shield, so you build the United Front, you're defensive. That's why some people say, the MDF just makes us allies when it needs us to shield it. Because the shield does not itself take power. No. When I was formulating the new NDF program, it was considered too liberal. My formulation was, the people will take power and the army will smash the armed portion of the state. That's very different from you take power in an armed way. And so you were saying, maybe Joe was saying, that top-down idea must be there already in 82. next government to be all military people. You need civilians. But if they have no role in taking power, they will be seen as, we fought and we gave it to you. That was the thinking of the Ram. That's why they kept mounting coups against Cory. They felt they triggered EDSA, and Cory and the others benefited. So they say, that's ours. I mean, if you're in the party, by the time people will tell me, Ed, how do you guarantee that the communists, the left will not dominate the revolution? It's very simple. Take part. Because if you're not part of a struggle, you're waiting for the benevolence or a kind of patronizing accommodation. You earn your part. So for me, it's as simple as that. So if the legal and the non-armed has no real role in an overall strategy, how do you expect a strategy that is for armed and underground to give resources, give cadres, give it a role? Especially if your rivals are better at it, which is really what happened. I think the ambivalence about boycott elections is simply because your other not just none, but maybe anti, they have a comparative advantage.
You could say the comparative advantage of the CNL is it's not straitjacketed by the genuine verbiage or the verbiage of
but that
authenticity.
up to a certain point, by that time I was telling you, including myself, technically I was not leading the CNL because I had already other assignments. I was helping the MDF. So for me, the organic, a lot of people who were very much part of the early CNL eventually later had other assignments. The new CNL, that's why very few could hold it together. I mean, we were not part of that attempt. It was people who were organic and maybe younger people, or even if they were older, maybe they never thought through. Maybe they didn't go through the angst of provisional, but not arbitrary. They simply said, this is it.
Generational shift.
Very hardliners, really. They really think that parang it's almost like, I think there's really progressive possibilities in the church, or that's simply something that you have to live with and tolerate. So in a sense, they were almost more Marxist than the Marxists. Sometimes that happens, that a Marxist might be more tolerant of the church than the radical Christians who cannot forgive the church for not fulfilling its rhetoric. I give you an example, the church rhetoric is like this. Give me your most radical and I'll up you one more because we're eternal. So it promises 100% commitment. When it delivers 10%, you're disappointed. The communists and the Marxists do not only have no illusions about the church, no progress. It's below zero. It's not 100. It's not. It's below zero. So when it delivers 10%, surprise. So they almost swing to the other and say, my God, there's more possibility here. But of course, any radical Christian will say, what? You're satisfied with 10% of a church that asks everything from us? I mean, when I was arrested the first time, the colonel in charge was saying, really angry at people like you. Before, we used to see a priest, a nun, a pastor, and they are natural allies of the government. Now, we look at all of them with suspicion. I said, oh my God, we succeeded beyond our... There was really... It's precisely because it was not expected that, in that sense, the role of the church in the Against Marcos was legitimately really celebrated. It was unusual. It's not... I mean, you'll have always a few, but this was I call it a social phenomenon. It is not just a few individuals. I mean, like I said, I knew only one third, and I'm not even sure if I was the key influence on them. So how do you explain a social phenomenon? You cannot explain it simply by an accumulation of individual biographies. There are social explanations. So my earlier one is there's something inside, there is the push and pull. So all that kind of thinking and discussion kind of petered out after a while because you need the work to continue and you have to work within that sector. But if many of you, and again, in line with your spirit of service, accept assignments and all others. So some theorize work in the legal peasant movement, some in the trade union, some in urban poor, some in so they were not part anymore of theorizing what is the role of the church and Christianity.
Synthesizing
or at most, you become you add a little from the sidelines. And still, sometimes I still allow myself to say, should I have insisted on continually playing that role? Because again, these are the choices you made. That's why I said later, I could understand what happened. It pained me that, but I accept the fact that no, CNL is that's it. That's a closed chapter. It will be there, but it's a shell of its old self. And that's why the question now is, people ask me, do we form a new one? What do we call it? That's another issue, no?
I'm interested in how it percolates up into popular culture, and I'm looking at Mike De Leon's films, Signos and Sister Stella L. What did you think? Did you ever see Signos?
After EDSA already.
Sister Stella.
We had some freedom to write and send messages, but in fact, I was wondering, what if we had the internet during martial law? What would it be like with tweets and Facebook and all that? What would have happened? I don't know, because before, I remember some nuns just recently, I had an older say, Ed, I'm one of those who visited you in Pampanga. And I had a note in the hem of my shirt. And I gave it to her. I was very nervous. But I felt the guard was watching. So I went to the toilet after reading it and swallowed it. Because at the early stage, it was like that. You couldn't communicate that easily. Then slowly it opened and opened. Later, we could write letters from prison and things like that. What can you imagine? What if we had this technology then? What would have happened to the Philippines? Because it would not be social media, cyber space by itself. You still had the solid warm bodies organization together with this. My gosh, that will be right now the reverse. If people say, you have only click activists, you don't have warm bodies anymore. You need both, no? But the combination, in a way, will work best in an open legal struggle. If you do that underground, that everyone will be caught because the military can trace every phone. It wouldn't work. So I don't know.
How about how about Sister Stella? In retrospect, what did you think of the film?
It captured that radical tradition of nuns who at the beginning weren't really, but then eventually drawn. And you can see whatever their theology or spirituality, what activates it politically is the labor movement. It's not by themselves and seeking out. As always said that you have the potential here. It becomes real when it encounters actual social movements, whether the social movements are ideologically driven or not. Because you can be radicalized by your theology. What will be its expression? One nun said, I'll go to Marcos, wrap a bomb around my skirt and blow him up. You can have that kind of expression, but it will take this form if you say, but there are social movements. So you don't look at the poor as people whom you have to pity and you have to sacrifice in their name. No, the poor have power. So I'll join them and help them. So for me, the condition for the full, call it blossoming of a theology of liberation is the existence, not started by the church, very rarely, of social movements that validate your theoretical proposition that the poor, although seemingly powerless, have the capacity to be agents of their own liberation. That's the first, almost moralistic. But then to undergo a more sophisticated analysis now exactly what is their role, if they're not organized, if that they're badly led. So it's just the challenge is from this broad, emotionally powerful, theological, moral concept to the nitty-gritty of how it is actually incarnated in a more complicated society where the issue of good, bad is not as easy. It doesn't mean everything is gray and there is extreme black and extreme white, but in between so many shades of gray. And there is a gray that is mainly black, that's slightly whitish, and there is one that is basically white but in some gray. So it's not black and white and 50% gray. In between, you have this still too. And that's where I think theology must be disciplined by other disciplines, theology, political science, including practical analysis and choices of what is the most effective action to do with what you have in a situation that allows limited options, but options nonetheless. Instead of holding back and say, I'll wait for a perfect situation, or pushing something that is beyond the possibility of the existing balance of forces and the structures. It's really for intellectuals and cadres and all that, but your responsibility is to translate that now into actual, what mobilization do you call for? What slogan do you raise? Whom do you give up on and whom do you keep attracting? It's a discipline that you cannot read in manuals or books. It's something you acquire by immersion, reflection, and there's still a lot of people there who are doing this. It's just that before a lot of it was concentrated within the National Democratic Movement because it attracted really most of the more thoughtful and more committed activists.
You've already touched on this, but could you say a little bit more about Buy-in Project and leading up to the 1986 boycott? I read your afterword to Benjamin Pimentel's book, Revolution, and you say the National Democrats suffer from the simplistic counterposing of the concept of the democratic to the revolutionary.
Yeah.
And I found that to be thought-provoking.
Because it was the reverse, though. The anti-left counterpose democratic to revolutionary. Say, if you're revolutionary, you cannot be democratic. You must be totalitarian. And the revolutionary, if you're democratic, maybe you're too liberal or reformist. And I was saying, come on. There might be different, but I always say, if you use if your value is democracy, you cannot really work the good alliance if you don't attribute to them and concede to them that they're also democratic. But you could say, I'm more democratic than you. Vice versa. A revolutionary will always see the others as to be humored if you think they have no revolutionary angle. But you can always say, I'm more revolutionary than you. So I said, if you really want a good, healthy relationship, you must agree. What are your core values? And you ask yourself, do I see? Now, it doesn't mean that's the only way, but that's the more serious alliance. Otherwise, the other is really tactical. A lot of it is really that manipulation and all that, which for me is one of my lessons. No? And not just in politics. In any relationship, if the other is too different, you will always just tolerate, maximum use, manipulate. I mean, you must find something in the other that you can relate to, even if it's in different measure. Then you start adjusting. And besides, just not static. You can build. In fact, you can work on each other to be. But of course, it's easier said than done in a situation like that. I mean, hindsight is always seem to be wiser. But in the heat of the moment, there's also impatience, there's emotions, there is disappointment. I mean, when I judge broad stroke, but I do not pin down specific people, and also the specific people in particular circumstances that I could very well be doing that if I were in their situation. So it's I don't think we have adequately given justice to an analysis, not just of what I felt was right and what I felt was wrong, because it's a bit more complicated. Because I had a little distance because of imprisonment, and then afterwards I remember the other guy saying, Ed, you can see possibilities because you operate there. You had a seamless transition from underground to legal. Us, we go to legal, we lose our mystique, which really happened, Former guerrillas lose elections. They have a mystique only when they are known. Then they reveal themselves,
Commander Dante, maybe.
they're not. No, Dante could have. I think he was charismatic. I mean, there are some whose anonymity is you might call it the myth. There are others who, in broad daylight, reveal another facet. But many others, especially if they're internal party apparatchik, are very good in market politics. Or if they do that, they swing to the other extreme, become really opportunists. So I don't know.
How about the role of the Catholic media, Radio Veritas? Were you surprised when that happened and Sin played the role that he played?
No, by the time it was clear that from the original Ut Omnes Unum Sint, I think 17, 18 bishops who stood up early. By that time, majority of the hierarchy, including Cardinal Sin, had already said, look, this is already writing on the wall. We better take our stand too. And I always say that the church was driven by three simultaneous powerful motivations. One is they were really angry at Marcos. But secondly, and they genuinely wanted democracy with the people. But they're also scared that if they don't join this, the communists will take over. What more powerful motivation you can than put all those together, especially when you're reassured. I don't know, is that true, that anecdote that the commander-in-chief Pacific, the US, something like sent word to the Catholic Bishops' Conference meeting somewhere that whatever you decide, we support you. It's always nice to take a moral stand when you have some power behind saying, you do what is right and we'll be there. I don't know whether that's true, and I don't want to be that cynical, but because the church can surprise people, because I said there is a martyr streak in the Catholic Church that can take a stand beyond what is considered reasonable, because we think that this life is not the end. So maybe there are certain things we can do right, which is worth risking our life or risking our reputation. So
there was, I think this was from your blog, a layperson mentioned, this layperson noted, former CNL Deputy Secretary in the Visayas region, noted a decline in pro-people and cause-oriented activities of the church after 1986. For many activists, there was hope in the new administration. What did this, new democratic space do to the movement?
Well, it's all sorts. I think the hope is, you see, if before you are always worried, you'll be tailed, you'll be arrested, and all of a sudden you can move freely, obviously you say. Secondly, the Cory government, although dominated by conservatives, had liberals and even progressives. No? You had in the labor, Bobit, Sanchez, you had Jokno in the human rights, you have Salonga. I mean, so it's a joker, they thought would be. So long as you don't, people immediately, it's Cory or no, it's the whole government. Of course, if you only look at Cory and Ramos, and then really you start wondering what's this the same. But if you look at here, the social sector, you would have, and even Bert Romulo wanted renegotiating the debt. No, so it's not. So in that sense, there was an initial hope, and it's a matter now of how soon that faded and how long you pursue it. In our case, we tried to maximize what is possible without illusions, while others were saying it's not going anywhere anyway. Waste time. Except they swung to the other and call for an overturn. We told them, come on. I mean, at the very least, it might be premature, not just analytical, but who will believe you? They'll think then, you thought you were for democracy. No, you're actually ideologically driven and power driven. So for me, that's the question is, should you keep that position for the whole transition of 6 years? Unfortunately, in my case, I wasn't here in the second part of that, because up to 87, I was here arguing this guy. When I left end of 87, I was told by people in the movement, don't come back, they'll just kill you. So I had to stay out for quite a while.
You were in Europe at that point? Were you in Europe, or you were still
Yeah,
in
you
the
know.
Philippines?
No, that was when I got to know Grunwig and Denmark. I was invited to talk on my way home. I was already in Hong Kong. They said, you return. We can't guarantee your safety. So I stayed there until 92 when Ramos took over. So people say, you're stupid, Ed. Just when a former general becomes, I said, I can't stay in Europe. When things are happening in the Philippines. I remember that I was telling my wife, if I cannot return to the Philippines, I don't want to do politics in the Netherlands. My choice then was I would go to South Africa because Mandela was about to be released, and they said, oh, this will be interesting. Maybe we'll promote popular democracy in South Africa. And I did. I had very good relationship with the ANC in exile and also the SACP in exile. So I knew about the politics I knew who of the African churches were more class-based SACP and who were more broad ANC-based. So it's interesting. In fact, it was a mutual appreciation of each other because they said, oh, I know, how were you thinking in the Philippines? Because they said, oh, you're ahead of us. I said, no, you're going to get much more than we ever could because you'll be the new government. You'll have a big responsibility. In our case, we just had a little share, But similar analysis saying, it's not a simple thing of one is gone and the new one will take care of everything. There will be accommodations. There will be people there who will be too impatient, maybe turn opposition is too early, like the PAC and others against the ANC. It's a very difficult task when the thing again is you have a radical vision. Do you pause and consolidate something that is not so radical so that you can move on? Or do you say, no, don't let that consolidate. Keep continuing. Except that the one who can reconsolidate is the right. If the left cannot achieve something and consolidate, the one in a position to return is really the right. Because they've never lost their vision and they're very good at settling for what they can get. They're more, I always say, if you use materialism as a category, the right is more materialist than the Marxists. The Marxists sometimes are utopian. The idealists trying to, well, I guess part of it is a voluntarism about the will. That's why Gramsci would say, pessimism of the intellect. You do analysis seriously, you'll be pessimistic. It's the will that will make you optimistic.
Looking back, are you happy with what popular democracy was able to achieve as an idea and maybe as a way of regrouping?
No. I mean, we could have done more. But again, we did not see it as an independent current by itself. We wanted to influence the National Democratic Movement and influence the non-National Democrat to come together. People expected more from us. Looking back, in fact, they were so disappointed. But I said, we made our choice. We didn't want to create a separate political... All we were being urged, hey, create your own movement, your own party. I said, no, it's not my ambition. So I don't know. It's these are some of those what could have been. You make choices, you accept that you achieve some, but you forgo others. So even right now, people are saying, come on, if we pursued popular democracy and its discourse and its practice, then we would have at least a counterfoil to populism instead of the counterfoil to that being liberal conservative democracy on the one hand and the revolutionary left. There is no progressive alternative. So that's why I was saying, we were in one sense, we had the choice to be progressive popular or popular progressive. And in a sense, we didn't want to be a discourse of progressive popular. We just had to popularize the progressive. But the real challenge would have been to tease out the progressive in the popular. But that would mean it might oppose the progressive that is trying to be popular. Because again, it would mean Filipino, are they willing to settle for less? These are all very culturally specific questions that are, again, hindsight could have been what might have been.
But do you feel like there wasn't a venue to mediate these questions in a way that maybe a legal party might have?
Well, actually, we were supporting, initially, the Partido ng Bayan they couldn't decide. So we already were forming movement for new politics. Then later, when they decided, they kind of hijack our name and call it the Alliance for New Politics. I said, that's our word, that's not yours. But the interpretation was again, and again, I was helping them. Imagine we were just starting and the party will say, hey, don't take elections too much. We haven't even started. They're already warning us about excess. I mean, so for me, the whole dilemma of we have a larger framework and we cannot even play serious tactics. So but again, these were narrow windows, and afterward you also had killings, and I mean, it's not so easy to judge people you disagree with. If they say you pay attention to the spaces, they pay attention to the constrictions. You pay attention to what you've achieved. They pay attention to the losses. I mean, when I was talking about democratic space coming out of prison, friends from Davao, I don't know how they did that because there was no texting. What democratic space, Ed? The battalions guarding Marcos in Metro Manila were released because Marcos is gone, and they're here attacking us and bombing us in Davao. So, post-EDSA, there is more violence here than before EDSA. So, but here, we're out. So, both are real. So, what do you use to describe the whole situation. You cannot say on the one hand, on the other. So it's really, there is a tendency for people to make sweeping, unified, or average the analysis rather than saying there are certain situations where you just have to recognize the different facets, and what will give it coherence is not your analysis there, but the previous story you are pursuing. So for someone who saying, well, the sooner the illusion closes, the better for all of us. Well, some were saying, the longer we can push that, there is more chance for more people to grow. That is not an analytical issue. That is a choice. And then you start using a test, correcting it with your reading of the analysis to make sure it's not an illusion, it's not a justification of a choice you already made. And again, I said it didn't last that long. We were not all in the same place. There were, very early on, there was already people in the party who kind of condemned us. They said, dismantle all popular democratic formations. I remember, what do you mean you condemn us without hearing? I invoke proletarian justice. Okay, Ed, we will postpone. I said, don't postpone. You're just postponing the execution. But you have already condemned us. Things like that. It's hard. But in my case, I said, okay, I can understand. Anyway, I don't intend to return to underground or rise. Let me just work on these newly politicized people so that they don't become subordinated and subject to simply the conservative, liberal, democratic agenda. Then maybe we were progressive. No? That's why I went into popular education. That's why I go local. I mean, the nationalists, because the nationalists, there's a certain level of abstraction. And eventually related to the center of power. They talk structure, but they don't really talk structure. They talk of who holds the power at the center. And that it's like determines everything. No government in the Philippines was not mixed. It's a mixture of many things. It's a little progressive possibility, a little terrible dark side here, somewhere in between. Will that be like that forever? They're saying, come on, it can't just be like that. Model. That's why something like the Dela Project comes in and says, make it clear. That's why some in the National Democracy, that's something closer to what we want. Except it's the wrong person.
I think I've gone through all of my questions. Do you have any follow-up comments about what we've been discussing, or any sort of closing statements?
My closing is very simple. My wife is saying, no more time. Go, you eat. Now, people ask me, in the end, what is the framework through which I look not just at what's happening, but pursue what I want to do. And I use a phrase, it's a favorite phrase of mine. It might be the title of a book if I ever write it. From 1968, came from Medellin when the Latin American bishops met and issued the letter to the Third World. It was translated by Orbis, New York, into English, and I misremembered the title of the book. When I read it now to check, the title is Beyond Honesty and Hope. My phrase is Between Honesty and Hope. You see, the Latin America said there's a lot of problems, honestly. You can get depressed, get very angry. On the other hand, there are movements working for change, but they're inadequate. But they're there. So that's hope. So if you only talk too much about honesty, you'll either be depressed or you want utopian radical, or you get prey to populist demagogues. If you pursue hope without the discipline of honesty, you might be illusionary and all that. But to live between honesty and hope in that tension. Hope is your driver and honesty is your discipline. And there is the creativity. That's the first. The second one is, they ask me, okay, 9 years in prison, 9 different prisons. Did you learn anything? 2 things. One, I can be a consultant on comparative prison architecture. What is escape-proof, not escape-proof. The more serious one, I learned patient impatience. Impatience is the noun. You must remain impatient. Then you discipline it with patience. Certain things will not change immediately, but it will even take longer if there is no impatient pushing. But you push impatience without the patience, you condemn others, leave them behind too early. You miss out on opportunities simply because they are less than what you want. And so you end up being frustrated. So for me, in the end, you distill certain keywords in your life. And there was a time I thought these were both completely very original. Now I'm discovering there are certain books. Come on, that's my word. How come someone has written about patiently impatient? That's mine. And between honesty and hope. But those two, I mean, in a way, I thought them through by myself. But that's true of all human beings. You're not so original. Some other people might also have arrived at that. But in my case right now, so for example, very clear. How do you look at Duterte? Between honesty and hope.
I look forward to the memoir, actually.
No, it's not going to be a memoir. I'm not going to write my... Okay. It's really a reflection on what have you learned about trying to bring about change closer to the ideal. And that's it. Mm-hmm. Between honesty and hope and patient impatience. Something like that.